Welcome to the Sportsman's Voice podcast, your inside connection to outdoor legislation. From the Beltway to policy happening your way, we're covering it all. I'm your host, Fred Bird. Join us as we explore public land access, wildlife and fisheries management, Second Amendment rights, the triumphs that shape our nation, the sports we all love, and the stories that fuel our passion for the great outdoors. This is the Sportsman's Voice podcast. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Sportsman's Voice podcast. It is Thursday, which means it's time for another feature episode of the Sportsman's Voice podcast. This week, we're welcoming in newly minted Director of Forest Policy for CSF, John Culclasure. I got a bunch of topics I want to get into. There's a lot to unpack and dive in with this new position and forestry as a whole. So sit back, relax, and remember, you can always put this on 1.25 or 1.5 speed. I did listen to myself. It's a little crazy. I know y'all are aware I talk fast anyway. So all that to say, if 60 minutes sometimes is a commitment, I remind you can do that and kind of work through the show a little faster and still get all the great information. So all that housekeeping, let us now turn to our guest, John Culclasure. Let's go. John, welcome. Great to have you.
Thanks, Fred. Honored to be here. Thanks for inviting me to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's certainly exciting. CSF, we continue to grow our footprint, our capacity to provide lawmakers and partners our expertise at the state level, at the federal level, especially, and now with your new role as Director of Forest Policy, formerly the Director of the Southeastern states. It's a pretty big deal, and it's big to communicate what we're able to do at CSF, and then for you professionally with a forestry background, what's the reaction? How's it been so far?
Yeah, it's exciting. It's a new path for CSF as far as having a full-time position dedicated to working on forest policy. CSF's been working on forest policy for a long time, prior to even when I started 8 years ago. And then we've been growing our emphasis in this area. And so now that I've transitioned over to it, a little bit of a learning curve here and trying to shed some of my state duties. As I still get a lot of phone calls and emails from my state duties. But diving in head first, building new relationships, establishing new contacts in the forestry space, the forest industry, particularly also in the sportsmen's community, because a lot of the sportsmen's groups also have a long history and do a lot of work on forest policy, whether that's NWTL, Elk Foundation, Boone and Crockett, Rough Grouse, Quail Forever, so there are a lot of important partners in this space, and I'm excited to work with them more and be additive to their efforts.
And I would start out by acknowledging at least my observations, I think probably a lot of your everyday conservationist, hunter, angler, that forestry, and by no means is this a slight to forestry, but I liken forestry to like economics in the political world. Very high level, very heady, can often have some eyes glazed over. Admitting that it is by far one of the most important areas of conservation, much like economics and understanding how your money works and the people that are handling your money. So, I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but this is one to pay attention to. And you pointed out some of our partners over the last, 5 years anyway. A lot of the resources and funds in conservation are being kicked over to forestry projects and the management of that. So, quail, turkey, all those organizations, when you talk about the ability for mission delivery for them on the ground, this is where it's at right now. And this is what's happening, especially out in the West.
Yeah, wildfires is an ongoing issue out West. Wildfire management is an issue in the East as well, but we don't generally have the degree or severity of catastrophic wildfires or impacts to community towns that the Western states do. So, but yeah, back to your initial prompt there. forestry. It can be kind of complicated and a little heady sometimes. But, for basics, whether you're a deer hunter or a grouse hunter or quail or whatever, you want good habitat, and that starts with good forest management. And it's a lot of times landowners or public land managers can, it makes financial sense to generate a little revenue through timber management, put that stewardship money back into the land. It's a lot cheaper per acre to do prescribed fire than it is to build food plots, fertilize them, buy seed and all that. So, not saying that's not a nice cut it to the landscape as well, but forest management, open up the canopy, get more sunlight to the forest floor. You're going to have more herbaceous cover, more food per acre for your grouse species, and then you need that young regenerating forest for early summer habitat species like rough grouse. And those landscape, that habitat component is significantly lacking on particularly our federal public lands, our national forests, and that's where a lot of people do recreate, hunt, and so that's been it should be a primary focus of our organization to create good habitat, to maintain interest in hunting, and improve access for our community.
I think that's one of the important parts of that work is maintaining the access. I think some people are under the impression that every time government or, air finger quote bureaucracy puts their hands in stuff like this, it's an automatic shutdown of access for all, but especially for hunting, fishing, and trapping. Can you expound on that a little bit and maybe speak
Yeah,
to
I'd say
something?
like we talk about access a lot as far as physical access, being able to, think about out west, landlocked parcel, checkerboard issues with trust lands and that sort of stuff, border corner crossings or just landlocked pieces of public land. But even even if you are able to access the land that we all collectively own, if there's poor habitat and then there aren't species to hunt, then nobody's going to go there and there's no interest in it. And I think you've seen that particularly in the eastern United States, where you have a trending mature forest where a lot of the forests were heavily cut around the turn of the century, the 1900s. And now you have stands that are 100 or 80 years old. They're trending away from oak and hickory composition toward more mesitic and species that are as beneficial to wildlife. And so you've got closed canopy forests with not much habitat, and therefore populations like rough grouse or deer don't do well on public land, and then consequently you have less interest in that. That's pretty apparent, and the numbers show that. And I can tell you that through personal experience growing up with friends and family that don't want to hunt or don't keep bird dogs anymore. And I can't tell you the number of times I've walked my bird dogs around town and people say, "Oh, my dad used to have setters," or "I grew up with setters." I just gave them up because there's no birds to work them on. And
Sure.
that's for quail too, which is a kind of a different issue. But key component of access is having good quality habitat and good populations to hunt. And you can't get kids interested in the outdoors, take them hunting, and they don't see anything. So
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and it's when you identify these stands of old growth forests, I mean, they're certainly aesthetically pleasing. They're nice to walk in. But again, to your point, like from a wildlife habitat value, there's nothing there. They don't offer anything. Maybe they're the red squirrel, right? In a hemlock stand or something like that, eating cones. But beyond that, nothing's really happening in there. And it's where we kind of run up against some controversy and some drama and doing those select cuts and being good managers and stewards of those pieces, those tracks of old growth and ushering in those new growth and creating those edges for all the species you just talked about. How do we have that conversation as a forester with the general public who doesn't get it? All they see is you're going in there hacking trees and pretty soon a little Lorax is going to pop out and try to stop all the machinery.
that's a good question. The forest issues facing forest management are oftentimes analogous to hunting and wildlife management, where the general public doesn't have a good understanding of it. But I think once you educate them about it, they come around pretty quickly. So for hunting, we know the message that resonates really well is talking about feeding harvesting the meat and feeding your family. And I think the forest industry has similar takeaways from the wildlife forestry side. I think it's, dispelling a lot of the myths instead of showing a photo of after a timber harvest where there's nothing growing immediately after the harvest, say in the wintertime, which is what environmental groups put on the front page of papers when they're opposing a habitat project, versus showing that forest, when it's a 2 or 3 year old forest, a few years later when it has a ton of growth and blackberries and seedlings coming up. And if you put a wildlife camera in there, I mean, you see everything from game to non-game species in there, bobcats. That habitat attracts wildlife because there's food and cover. And when you cut trees, if you're cutting trees, it's not just about what you're removing from the landscape. The type of harvest that you pursue is influencing your next stand composition. So, if you're going to go ahead and do an even age management or clear cut, you're taking off all the species, so it's going to support species that are sun-loving species versus something like something that leaves more basal area. You might try to regenerate oaks and hickories and that sort of stuff. So, I would just tell folks to, like we do in wildlife management, science-based management, science-based rationale for what you do. And when you're looking at mature forests or old growth, which is a big issue right now in the States on some public land, but also there's the U.S. Forest Service is currently under the open comment period for the draft environmental impact statement for them to amend all land management plans for all units of the national forest system to incorporate consistent direction for old growth management. And, I would say our concerns are, really twofold. One, the wildlife habitat value that's going to be lost by having a top-down prescriptive approach by drawing circles on a map instead of taking into account the, local wildlife and forest health needs. And two, or three really, two, while mature forests or old growth may store carbon well, what's lost is that young forests and actively growing forests, they sequester carbon at higher rates than a mature forest. And actually, when you cut timber, you're taking that carbon off the landscape and locking it up and selling it in usable products. And people are now using that for really innovative things, like the new Portland airport is constructed down of mass timber. So there's a lot of benefits to also removing some mature timber. And we're not saying that there doesn't need to be any mature or old growth across the landscape. But, on the national forest system, that's already a significant chunk of the national forest, given that, I don't know what the percentages are that are more than a third or are already under wilderness study area or other congressionally designated areas that limit management, altogether. So, and the other concern about mature or old growth out west, particularly, is if those lands are not managed actively, aren't stewarded, and if they prescribed fire is not used, then the risk for catastrophic wildfire significantly increases. And you've seen that whether it's sequoias or even ponderosa pines, those trees that, like ponderosas, that are supposed to be fire resistant or actually, evolved with fire and have the really thick bark. When you have that understory that grows up and creates fire ladders, then the fire gets into the canopy, then you have a canopy fire. Then you have the whole forest burns down, and it might be so hot and severe that it burns the dust, the organic material. The soil is sterile. So then there is no wildlife habitat whatsoever. So people have this notion that just because a tree is old, that it has intrinsic value. And yes, there are some species that are old growth obligate, but a lot of species are generalists, and they might use old growth sometime, but they would, like Cereal warblers or other things, they say what used to be argument was that, the mature forests don't cut. Well, it turns out they do a lot of foraging and feeding in the young growth areas are really special habitat. So, and if you have a large fire in mature forest, the amount of carbon that's emitted from that is just huge. So I think there's some numbers floating around out there. There's some of the fires in California the last couple of years have, erased all of California's emissions targets or their goals, accomplishments they've done just through one fire season through bad forest management. there's a host of reasons to continue to use prescribed fire, to use timber management to improve wildlife habitat, to improve forest health, increase forest resiliency, and just improve access for sportsmen and women and protect local communities.
There's so much to unpack there, and I got to figure out where I want to start because you're talking about everything you just did, and I'm my lights are flashing. So, oh, this. So first of all, this spring, I was down at a national forest in Maryland on their Eastern Shore hunting turkeys with one of our colleagues, and they had done some prescribed burning on a couple sections of this, and instantly they'd done it probably a few weeks before, maybe, and there was already green shoots coming up, and really enriched that soil, and you're already seeing benefit from that, and it's fair and okay to acknowledge the controversy and some of the drama, a lot of it that comes around fire and prescribed burning, and to your point, because so many forest stands have not been managed and not been actively managed, you have this huge fuel load, especially in the West where it's dry. And essentially, it's just a kindling box, just waiting for someone to strike a match, whether it's by lightning, by, acts of God, or someone flicks a cigarette butt out the window. I mean, it doesn't take much over here in the East. Our forests, as you well know, are more moist, but in drought seasons, we can have forest fires just as easy. I mean, just north of the border, I'm not sure what happens up there. Maybe you can talk about it. In Eastern Canada, it is burning. And we get these big, hazy days here in the summer, and the smoke comes down and, blankets everything from New England down to the mid-Atlantic states and I think in the Mississippi River east of it. And that's a pretty significant fire to cover all of that.
Yeah, I mean, wildfire smoke, because a public health issue. It really aggravating for asthma. There's a lot of studies showing other negative effects. So, I mean, we should be viewing fire management, forest management as a public health issue in a lot of places. And it's not, like you're saying, it's not just isolated to, well, you live in Idaho and you live in the Valley, Kitchen Valley, fires, smoke sinking to impact your day of, quality of life on a daily basis. But, that to us all, like last summer particularly and previous summers. Sometimes DC has a certain view in the haze, or New York, because of all the fires. But yeah, fire requires three things, right? Heat, fuel, and oxygen. Well, we can't impact oxygen. Heat, that's what's the daily climate, and of course other climate mitigation things we can do long term. But really, on a day-to-day basis, one of the three things that you can control and impact is fuel. And so, outside of the argument of, sometimes people get lost in the argument over, well, forest fires or the increase in severity or numbers of fire, that's because of climate change. Well, whether it's because of climate change or whether people get lost in the argument over climate change, or whether climate change is the blame for the increase in severity and the number of wildfires. One of the things that we can control as land managers is fuel buildup. So, you look at 100 years of fire suppression out west on public lands, and then now you have ongoing litigation from environmental or anti-forestry groups that want to sue or do work through the Forest Service objection process to oppose, forest health improvement projects. They're just delaying and adding to the fuel buildup on the forest floor. So, aside from, what, increasing temperatures across the globe, the reality is if there was no fuel buildup, there wouldn't be those fires. So that's the one thing that we can't control or can't have any influence on. And that's why it's important to actively manage those lands. So if the fire does come through, it's a low severity fire, and it can improve the habitat, not the catastrophic fire that's really devastating for not just wildlife habitat, but rivers, streams, watersheds, reservoirs, and water supplies for cities out west.
It seems to be more of a challenge to work on these public lands, given some of the bureaucracy that exists through these alphabet organizations. And it becomes confusing, right, to the public as well. Like, who's in charge of this and who's really at hand. There's multiple partnerships between nonprofits and federal organizations. It's enough to like drive you crazy who's in charge of some of these things. It, if you can speak to that a bit, and then is it easier to do this stuff working with private land partners, or is it can you do a whole lot more on these large swaths of public?
Well, there's, what, 193 million acres of national forest, 245 million acres of pure land management, I don't know, 90 or whatever the millions of acres, 10 million acres of national park service land. Then you add in state wildlife management areas, state forests. So I would say that public land management is a very important component, but private land management is equally important. Fire and wildlife or beetles, they don't understand artificial man-made boundaries drawn on a map. So if there's a lot of fuels built up on private lands, the fire's going to jump. So that's why there's been a lot of emphasis recently from some of the forest industry and doing cross-boundary, wildfire prevention work and fire breaks, and also wildfire suppression efforts. I think it's important that as the wildlife community continue to invest not only in farm bill programs and other private landowner assistance technical programs that are going to support people managing their land actively, but also to facilitate increased levels of management on those public land, federal and state. Although I will say, in general, a lot of the frustration from the sportsman community and a lot of the focus is on federal public lands like the U.S. Forest Service because, generally states have wider, not always, but generally states have wider discretion to manage their land. They are subject to the same, basically, NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, processes that give anti-forestry groups a really strong arm to hinder projects. So whereas, and you can see that borne out a lot, one area I used to hunt a lot in North Carolina was a game land on what they call wildlife management, they call it game land. It was a state game land. It was adjacent to the national forest, and that state game land was managed pretty well. And they didn't, do what people might think, which was just clear cut the whole mountainside and ruin trout streams. They did some timber management and did a lot of fire, and it was the hunting there and the experiences, the wildlife that you would see and interact with, the birds you bump with your dog. The numbers there were just dramatically or significantly higher than they were on the adjacent federal land. And so I've seen that play out a lot of places. I think a lot of people have that similar experience of seeing state forests being managed actively, wildlife management areas being acted very well. Then they go hop across the ridge and there's national forest, and it's like, hey, where is the habitat? Where are the animals? There's nothing here. So there is a lot we can be doing on federal land, whether that's through partnerships with folks like NWTF, through stewardship contracting or Rough Grouse Society, and a lot of these good our hunting critter organizations that do on the ground habitat delivery. The Forest Service has a lot of authorities that they need to use and continue to use, increase category exclusions, other things that they can get work done that doesn't need a legislative fix to do more work. And there are some legislative challenges that need to be dealt with, and we're actively working on. But funded is also underfunded is a recurring problem for the Forest Service, especially as fires continue to draw a lot of their staff and attention away from planning and implementation of habitat projects.
So I think you just answered my next question, which was going to be, what's the biggest obstacles in the way of managing those federal lands as you juxtapose them to state managed, and it's just it's a function of funding, and then is it a function of manpower as well? I mean, I guess one lends to another. If you don't have resources, you can't hire people to go out there and do this.
Yeah, I think over the years, the amount of emphasis that's been in the Forest Service timber, I don't know how it's categorized, but timber, we might call colloquially, the timber budget has decreased and the roads budget has decreased. That if you don't have roads, you can't maintain water bars, you can't keep silt out of ditches, where roads come off the system and are decommissioned, and then you put more money in other pockets like recreation or whatever the other categories may be. Just decrease emphasis on that going to lead to fewer projects getting completed. But really, it's the NEPA planning teams that project takes on average 5 to 7 timber project or habitat improvement project takes 5 to 7 years to get through on federal land. So there's a whole process, a lot of public input, meetings, and analysis, consultation with other agencies, federal and state, to get that done. So it's just a lot of work to get the project done on federal land, and consequently fewer resources and fire diverting attention away. There's lots of work being done, and you can see that from Georgia all the way up to where you live. White Mountain National Forest. There's people threatening litigation currently on a habitat improvement project. I think if you looked at most of the forest plans, the land management plans for the individual national forests, they have early successional habitat goals, probably around 8%, and I'd say pretty much every single one of them, I would say that every single one has failed to meet that goal, and a lot of them are even less than 1% early successional habitat. They're just failing on failing. So that's not to dog our federal land managers. There's a lot of reasons for that, and they get dragged through the mud in the papers by anti-forestry groups. They're trying to do the right thing and do good habitat. It takes a lot of work, takes a lot of partners, takes a lot of public support, and that's one of the things that I want to be doing in this new role, is really increasing our engagement from the individual habitat project level to the forest planning process as well, in addition to working on federal legislation and regulatory regulations that are going to impact our ability to increase the amount of good wildlife habitat on the ground.
So I'm going to come back to this. I want to put a pin in this idea of the anti-forestry movement and what their motivations are. But I do want to hit on, with your goals and now having a full-time position, what is the capacity of that? What is your capacity to actually get into that? Now just being able to really dial in on this work, especially, your experience, almost a decade here with the organization. Imagine your Rolodex is pretty deep, especially in certain areas of the country. How does that lend itself to you being able to be proactive on some of these things?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Fred. So yeah, I'd like to kind of leverage our state level sportsmen's caucuses, particularly to increase support for habitat management on public land, state and federal. You've got 154 national forests in the country. There's no way that I'm going to be able to comment on every single timber project or habitat project and stay involved in the process, physically go to meeting, and then there's a forest plan revision. Yes, we want to be commented and providing substantive comments, but to go physically to fly around the country to go to those meetings is going to be limited. So we're going to have to leverage our relationships, national and in-state, with the sportsmen's community, NGOs, state fish and wildlife agencies. I want to expand that to the state forestry agencies. Like we currently have good relationships with all our state fish and wildlife agency directors. I think I need to have good relationships with all of our state forestry directors and provide that link to the sportsman community and the needs of, wildlife and wildlife habitat. They have state forest action plans. We should be commented on those. And I really want to get our state sportsmen's caucuses. So if there's a timber project in New Hampshire, I'd like CSF to weigh in, us provide substantive comments. I can be involved in the objection process, but I'd also really like the state sportsmen's caucus to weigh in. If their letter or their input may not be as substantive as CSF would be, but just a general statement of support and administrative record showing that hey, we're a bipartisan caucus. we represent the interests of sportsmen and women in X state. And this habitat project, we're fully supportive of it. We understand the benefits for wildlife, forest health, and we know you're going to get some blowback in the papers, but we encourage you to, move forward with the project and implement it because Forest Service needs our support. They need that support, and it's easy when they get a lot of pushback. It's easy for things to delay and get projects being pushed off the desk, and we've seen that time and time again. So I think CSF can really be helpful by leveraging our existing sportsmen's caucuses, and then work through you and say, hey, Fred, man, there's a really important project in Vermont. What's your network of sportsmen's groups in the state? Of course, some of our groups are already going to be involved in weighing in on that, like Grouse Society, for example. But there might be other groups that don't, like bear hunters, or think about that after timber harvest, all the berries coming up. That's a lot of soft mass for bears. So yes, maintaining some mass producing trees for oaks and hickories, beech nuts is going to be important as well. But across the landscape, that's going to be there. So having that diversification of habitat across the landscape is critical for a lot of species. So I think once we could really get that message out, and whether sometimes it's just flagging that information for other groups to pay attention to. They may be focused on the big picture thread of ballot initiative to end bear hunting, but at the same time, if we could get those groups, and especially the local sportsmen, to weigh in and go to meetings and voice their support for management, I think that'd go a long way.
I guess anecdotally, so let me start this way. Obviously, here at our organization, we pride ourselves on the work we do and the deep numbers in our caucuses that we have at the state legislative level, as well as the CSC, and even to that extent, our governor's sportsman's caucus at just the other day, coming in at 30 with Governor Landry down in Louisiana joining. So all that to be said, bipartisan, bicameral at the federal level, most of our issues, it's easy to say that these aren't partisan issues. Everyone should be able to get over on this. I say that because anecdotally and observing over the years, it seems that forestry issues get caught up in partisanship. Am I wrong on this, or is what I've seen?
Yeah,
You're accurate.
You were to paint a broad brush. I think you would probably say that it does get lost. It does get caught up at the federal level, particularly on federal forest management reform legislation. It does oftentimes get caught up in bipartisan politics, but that's not always the case. The 6R Forest Act was introduced this year, was sponsored by Natural Resource Chairman Congressman Bruce Westerman from Arkansas, Republican, Gilly Forrester in Congress, right? So he fits that mold, but he's very smart on forestry issues. But it's also co-sponsored by Congressman Scott Peters, a Democrat from California. So I think particularly people out west have seen the problems with forest management, fire management. I think that's hopefully smoke issues and watershed issues. So I think that's starting to change the conversation a little bit, and that's through time and education, and just showing people that the sky is not falling. If you cut a tree, there are a lot of benefits to that. And I think that just like in hunting and wildlife issues, I think education, on the ground, out in the field, showing people, congressional staff, congressmen and women, showing them things on the ground and showing them the benefits of habitat management. So, whether
it really does come down to the storytelling of it, and it's something I've maintained for years. It's easy to tell the story of a declining species. Like, I go to turkeys by default, right? And you look at the reintroduction of the wild turkey and the effort, and that is sexy work. That is something volunteers and agency staff can all come together and work around and coalesce and really like champion something like that. It's just easy because you can see it. And kind of back to my opener about people kind of glazing over about this work, forestry, they hear it, but like it's hard to latch onto because it's such a long, slow burn with some of this stuff, and no pun intended with the out west, the burn part. It seems like that's the one that everyone can relate to because, again, they can see it. A lot of people are affected by it out west. It seems like that storytelling is one of our biggest challenges. And how do we make it relatable and interesting to the average sportsman or woman to get fired up about forest management and policy the same way they would about reintroduction of wild turkey or Rocky Mountain elk?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think if it impacts you, you care about it, and that's probably a lot of it. I will say along the bipartisan or the bipartisan discussion, there has been a lot of growth in the right direction as far as talking about carbon sequestration, and particularly on private land forest management. People are realizing, and there are a lot of groups that promote forest management and working forests as a solution to addressing climate change. For that reason we talked about earlier, you have to be actively growing forests are going to sequester high rates of carbon. And also, if you have private forest land that continues to be profitable, or at least be able to pay the taxes on your land for landowners, that land, maintaining economic viability of that land is going to disincentivize someone from selling their land to a developer, because once that turns into a parking lot, there is no carbon sequestration at all. So it's really important to have strong market and keep working lands working.
As far as emerging trends, I mean, obviously we've kind of dialed in on the fire part of this. You referenced the Fix Our Forest Act. What's out there? What's on the horizon? Kind of the next big thing aside from the two items we just talked about.
So yeah, fire management is an ongoing thing. Litigation is an ongoing issue. There's been some attempts at reforming that. Fix Our Forest Act has some litigation reform in it as well. Carbon arguments on public land. You're seeing that for state lands, state legislation, where we're seeing that a lot in the Northeast. Having forest reserves or off-limits areas, the management under a carbon protection guise. Kind of goes back to what we talked about, share old growth rulemaking stuff. Carbon market, that's a brand new thing, and we're still trying to wrap our heads around that. There's not a standardized accrediting approach to it, and there's a lot of business in that. So that's TBD. I don't think we have a position on that.
Can you give like a brief description of it, or is it just too?
Yeah, you're seeing all the kind of like a big company will buy carbon credit to offset their carbon footprint or carbon input. So somebody jet sets around the world, then they're going to go buy carbon credits because they feel good about that. Well, that's good and all, but how is that impacting land management? So there are a lot of businesses out there that will then connect with forest landowners, and they'll either delay a harvest or not harvest at all to keep carbon, stored in those forests. So that could, impact mills and markets. And there's a lot to unravel there. And I'm just starting to scratch the surface to learn about myself. Yeah. I don't really feel comfortable taking out a position on it, but that's a growing area of interest, and it's something that we kind of need to wrap our heads around.
Recently, getting back to the new position here, you were introduced at the beginning of the month. We hosted a breakfast briefing on sustainable forest management and the official introduction of you in the position. What was the feedback? What was the reaction to that? And kind of talk about all those in the room and what it means to those partners.
Sure, yeah. We hosted a breakfast briefing end of July. We had 3 panelists help moderate the discussion. We have Brian Tenney, President and CEO of NAFO, National Alliance of Forest Owners, Bill Bergamo, Executive Director of Federal Forest Resource Coalition, and then we had our CSF's newest board member, Brian Loma, forgive me on the pronunciation of that, but he's the recently retired CEO of Westervelt, private forest management company that manages about 600,000 acres from down to Alabama area. So it was kind of wanted to highlight our this new position and our growing emphasis on forest policy, and also just the wide breadth of the issues from private to public land, So Bill and Bergamo is focused on federal forest management. We talked about a lot earlier today. But then NAFO is focused, represents forest landowners, timber companies that own a significant amount of land, whether that's in the Southeast, Pacific Northwest, Maine area, or the upper Midwest. So, and as you know, although we've been talking a lot about federal public lands, particularly in the East, most states are like roughly 90% or more held in private ownership. And
Right.
forest, timber companies and other forest landowners own significant amounts of land. So that's important for a host of reasons. One very obvious is hunting leases. A lot of these companies lease their acreage to hunters. So maintaining those lands in a working state and keep the lands working. If they keep having hunting leases offering hunting leases, then that's going to allow more people to hunt, which is what we want people to be out in the woods hunting. My hunt club here in Virginia, we own a little bit of land, and then most of our lease is from a timber company. If we didn't have that lease that was developed or sold off, then we want to be able to hunt that area. So that's just a significant thing for us to consider. But also, a lot of the wildlife conservation is really going to take place on private land. If more than 90% of the lands are privately held, well, wildlife is going to be found. Game and non-game is going to be found on those private lands. So, for those landowners, they're really active stewards, good stewards of the land, doing what's right, not just for their timber and forest resources and their shareholders, but they're also doing what's right for the species that are there. Which a lot of times the issues they may face are regulatory or threats from that side for species listing, and to have a heavy-handed approach to dictate how they can manage their land. So there's been a lot of growth and really a lot of success stories from the forest industry leading on conservation, working with non-traditional partners on species conservation, like gophers and salamanders, aquatic species, and red cockaded woodpecker, federally endangered species that lives in the longleaf pine forest in the Southeast. So that's all collaborative conservation, proactive management to avoid species declining to a level where they have to get listed. And that's just being a good steward of the land. That's what forest folks want to do, and that's what wildlife managers want to do. And I think that shows that you can manage land for forest products, and you can support wildlife conservation as well, and maintain hunting access. So, and then you support local, communities and jobs, and it's just a win-win for everybody.
So that brings me back to that pin. The anti-forestry, forest management crowd. Like, when we have anti-hunting, again, it's one of those things. Like, conceptually, I can see an anti-sign, right? Because I don't understand them in the fact that they get so passionate about a crazy position, but I can understand that there is a side for that, right? Because they can see someone go out there, shoot a deer, and get upset about that. What is the motivation, and where is the anti-side of anti-forestry management coming from? Who are these people? And, is it the stereotypical, like, tree hugger and chain themselves to a tree so you can't cut stuff down? Or
Yeah,
I just don't understand the motivation here when
some of that
management allows for more trees, more habitat, more positivity on the environment.
right. So yeah, it's that crowd plus their modern day successors who are more sophisticated and have legal teams and lots of money to pursue what they want to do. And I think there is a good argument, and some lands are not managed and are in passive areas, wilderness or whatever the management area may be, or streamside management zones, riparian buffers. where there are going to be characteristics of that forest that would not be there to the degree that it would be in a stand that you just came in and cut. So that you get into like biodiversity arguments and that sort of stuff. But by the same token, when you manage timber, you're supporting biodiversity by increasing the herbaceous cover and number of species that grow and have sunlight that would never grow if those trees weren't managed. So, and you got to remember that when you're cutting timber, a lot of times you are mimicking a natural disturbance that took place a long time ago that doesn't take place now today. So, fires and the heat, because they're suppressed because the landscape's so fragmented, so we put them out to protect, homes and towns and stuff. Windrows, tornadoes, ice damage, just a lot of these natural disturbances that fire is there, stand clearing disturbances that are going to open the canopy to create the habitat. When you're harvesting timber, you're a lot of times creating that sort of habitat.
You mentioned like the riparian buffers and things like that. It would make sense to me that there's great value in those characteristics of the stand. I would think managers wouldn't want to disturb that because of the infrastructure that those trees and that timber provides for banks and can maintain that riparian zone. Am I off on that? Would managers?
Well, we would want to support it, something that is, instead of like having a prescriptive approach to every acre in the United States, it needs to be site specific. So, on private lands, most private lands are managed under, state best management practices, BMPs, and then that forest, manager can determine, well, hey, this slope here is not that steep. We can actually harvest a little bit closer to the stream, but this area is really steep, or this soil, or this, this is a really rocky area. This may not be appropriate for this type of treatment, or the age of the forest, or maybe we can go there and pull this one tree out to actually increase some habitat there. So, I think it needs to be, we would want to defer to forest and wildlife managers to make the best on the ground assessment of what can be done. And a lot of times you can get pretty close to a creek without impacting water quality at all, and put across adequate stream crossings and other protections for water quality. But I would not want to just put a arbitrary 300-yard buffer on a creek, because you also want to manage those areas, because those streamside areas or riparian areas are really critical to wildlife like turkeys. And so if it was all just mature forest forever, then there's no habitat created there, and then that may not be what you want either.
I know we're getting long on the clock here, and I want to be respectful. But just thought popped into my head. We were talking about managing for habitat for a myriad of reasons, but especially for access and for hunting. What about invasives, right? I'm looking out my window here at CSF Northeast headquarters, and I have a considerable amount of red maple. They're beautiful to look at. Love them on the landscape, except forest managers hate them because they're invasive up here. What, if any, thought goes into that? And when you do look at invasive species, if like what is a red maple taking a place of that an eastern deciduous forest would be lacking and is more beneficial?
Well, chestnut for one, which is basically gone from the landscape.
Yep.
A whole nother story there. But yeah, whether it's a woody species like a tree like red maple, or whether it's like Atlantis or tree of heaven, invasive tree species, or invasive herbaceous ground cover species like Nepal grass, or something that's going to really dominate the understory, prevent flowers from growing. Yes, invasive species management, that is a reason to conduct forest management treatment, and it's also something taken into account when you're carrying out those plans, whether that's through herbicides, post treatment to prevent non-native species from outcompeting species that you do want to regenerate. So on private land, they'll address that through site prep. On public land, That'll probably be through site prep. But less rigorous site prep, so herbaceous species. Herbicide treatments as well as prescribed fire. Because for example, if you harvested some timber, say, in West Virginia, and then the forest starts to grow back, and you have some non-native species that pop up, and they start to outcompete. 3-4 years in, you run a prescribed fire through there. Say oak species, which you would like to have more than like a red maple, but they are native here. But oaks are going to put their first few years of emphasis into their roots. They're generally fire adapted, so if you run a low intensity fire across it, it's going to kill off the competing vegetation that you don't want, and then those oaks are going to have a chance to shoot up and then become more dominant in that stand. And then that's other TSI, timber stand improvement. That's a way to come back into a stand, 10, 15 years in, selectively go through and help guide the species, the composition of that stand to select the species that you want to grow.
I can think back to walks in certain stands and seeing the site prep work, certain markings, and you start, if you have taken a dendro class ever in your undergrad or whatever you did, and you can start, identifying certain species, you're like, oh, that one, that's the invasive. You start figuring out the markings and stuff. It's really interesting. Just something else to look at and consider when you're out there waiting for that whitetail or that turkey to walk by, and even seeing some of the herbicide work done as well, and then go back probably a year later and see that, it's gone, but other stuff has come up in its place that I think is more preferable.
Sure. Yeah. You have to be careful when you're bringing in heavy equipment that they're not, being a vector for that distribution of invasive species seeds.
Right.
But, as a hunter, you can carry, or a hiker, you can carry them in on your boots. Birds drop seeds from invasive species. So, non-native invasive species control is something that everybody should care about. And it impacts everything.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly interesting to think about, and it's just another level of detail to this very complicated area of expertise, of which you're our expert. So going forward, certainly look to see great things and work together collaboratively in our respective regions with you. And it's certainly exciting for CSF to be able to have this portfolio dedicated to a full-time position. And again, going back to what we said earlier, just being able to provide that as a resource to our members in the state legislatures and on the Hill. It's important work.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Our fishery director, senior director, Chris Thornton, has done a tremendous amount of work and has a lot of big important wins for the fishing community, and he's been able to focus full time on fisheries. And I think with our increased emphasis on it and bring another voice to these issues, I hope we can elevate these and get more done too.
No doubt. John, thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
My thanks to John again for making the time to come on the program, talk about this exciting new position, new opportunity that he has before him, and certainly here at CSF, and our ability to grow and expand and just bring more professional advocacy and education to you, the legislative members that are listening, that are part of our NASC system, are part of the CSC on the Hill, our governors that listen. This is all good stuff. And then to be able to have policy-specific individuals like a Chris Horton, a Taylor Schmitz, and now John Culclasure in forestry as part of our cadre of professionals is just, it speaks to the power of the organization and its support, and that comes by way of good work, good collaborative work between our team and the Capitals, and that is no small feat and effort over a number of years. So my congrats to John for a job well done and bringing his expertise to this position, and certainly we look forward to nothing but good things here at the organization for John. And encourage you, if you are a legislator or a partner of ours and you have questions on the topic, John's your guy, and we can put him in touch with you when and where that is necessary. Yeah, I kind of joked a little bit at the beginning there, comparing, forestry and what it is compared to like economics and, kind of watch that stuff on TV. And if you're not into it, man, it could put you to sleep real quick. But I reiterate the fact that it's some of the most important stuff that we do, especially in conservation, because without forestry professionals being able to advise where resources, funds, identifying on the ground items to work with and improve, none of the other stuff happens without it. So again, not a slight in the least there, acknowledging the importance of it along with, some of the more intricate parts of that policy arena. There you go. That's the show. I want to keep this out as short as possible because the days are growing shorter here. We're at the end of August. I don't know about the weather in your neck of the woods, but here in the Northeast, man, it is starting to turn. This is what we affectionately call false fall. And we will get one more blast of summer heat, no doubt. We call that Hell's Porch. And then we get into real fall. But currently in New England, we are at false fall. And I'll take it because the air is dry. We're sitting in low 60s. As this podcast is dropping. And those are days I believe most of us are looking forward to, maybe even a little cooler at that. So if you tuned into the TSV Roundup yesterday, we highlighted the incoming seasons that are kicking off with doves. Bear season's opening up in the Northeast. That Maine's already open. I've already seen some beautiful bears taken in the state of Maine. We got a whole bunch of stuff opening up, youth season, so it's a great time of year, and no shortage of work as well in the policy arena coming up. Exciting time of year, to be sure. A bit of housekeeping here. If you are planning to join us at NASC this weekend, that means, again, this is dropping on August 29th, so you have through the rest of the month to get in on the early bird registration. After that, prices go up. So go to congressionalsportsman.org, find our events page, and go to NASC and get your registration in. And we'll hope to see you down there in Baton Rouge. Lots of good stuff lining up and being officially on the program. Some great outdoor opportunities as well have been lined up. So before those fill up, some of those field trips, get in there before, like I said, before there's no more seats in some of those. All right, that's our show. Tune in every Wednesday, as always, for the news around the nation with the TSV Roundup. No feature show next Thursday. Got a lot of events coming up, so we're going to bring you a lot of event sound and recaps from our banquet, from our event down at our chairman's vineyard, Richard Childress Vineyards, and then the aforementioned NASC Summit. So stand by for a lot of great episodes, a lot of cool content from the Hill, from around the country, and we appreciate the support as always. Signing off here, CSF is your inside connection to outdoor legislation. Until next time, so long. Thanks for joining us on this edition of the Sportsman's Voice podcast. Ladies and gentlemen, your support is crucial, and you can help us out right now by leaving a review, filling in those 5 stars where available, sharing this episode with friends and family, and engaging with us socially. CSF can be found on Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly known as Twitter. Together, we can protect the outdoor sports we love and continue to keep you informed wherever you are. That's it for this week. Until next time, we'll see you later.